Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks, and I'm with Josie Burgin Lawson, my mother. This series is called Mommeries, which is the autobiography of Josie Burgin Lawson. So if I remember correctly, we last left in Denver, and you covered some of the basics there. Maybe you could talk about your Israel trip?
Sure. Let's see. I think it was April 1983. There was a massive blizzard at the.
I remember that.
And it was a huge deal. Your grandfather Artel and grandmother Fosha were hosting a tour of 2 bus loads of Mormons to go to Jordan, Israel, and Cairo. For some reason, Richard wanted me to go because he knew I was having problems, and I guess he thought that would strengthen my testimony. What it did was demolish what was left of my testimony. Anyway, I didn't want to go by myself, but I did. They paired me up with David's wife, Lee, who David and Lee were non-members. I assume he still is. Or he had left the church and she was never a member. Let's see. We went there. Jordan was gorgeous. I loved it. It was really interesting. We went to Petra, which was fascinating. And we see Petra on TV and films all the time. It's funny because they use that facade, and that's all it is, that big ornate facade at Petra. When you go inside, it's basically just a dugout cave.
And for those not familiar, the most likely place for you to see it would be Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right before they go into the Holy Grail.
Yep. But we've seen it on other things too, so they like to use that facade. But like I said, once you go inside, and in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they use that facade, but what they go into doesn't look like the actual inside. Sorry, I'm blowing my nose.
You're fine.
The actual inside of the thing kind of does. I mean, it is basically a big cave. So anyway, so we went there, and it was fascinating. Then we went to Israel, and Lee and I got along great, by the way. It was just a really interesting trip. We went to Israel. I got a huge crush on the tour guide, which is interesting because when I looked at your dad's autobiography, he mentioned that he thought I had a crush on the tour guide. And he was right, I did. And the fact...
And just to clarify, he didn't go with you on that trip, correct?
No, he did not. But yeah, he was jealous of my crush on the tour guide. But the fact that I was getting crushes on so many guys, which was happening all the time, was an indication that there was a problem with our marriage. I mean, really. I said that to a friend of mine, Elisa Carlson Lloyd, who she was upset because she was married and her husband was mentally and emotionally abusive. And she kept getting crushes on other men, and it was upsetting her. And I told her, I said, well, you're looking for an escape route. And it's the same thing with Christy. Christy went through that too. You're looking for an escape route. And that's what was happening with me, is I got a huge crush on the tour guide who taught at, I don't know if it's the University of Israel, but, whatever big university is there, he was a philosophy teacher there. And he was extremely intelligent, which I always find attractive. And I mean, that's why I've been with Skip for 30 years, as I'm attracted to intelligence. So, anyway, yeah, it was an interesting experience. We stayed at the King David Hotel for a few days. We stayed at a kibbutz for a couple of days, which was awesome. I was surprised at how much I fell in love with Israel because I've never been a desert person, but it felt like home to me. I had a real hard time leaving because it felt like home. If I hadn't had a family at home, I might have tried to find a way to stay, and it wasn't my crush on the tour guide. It was just I fell in love with Israel. And they had their problems then. The tour guide was crazy, and he took us up to a boundary up by the Gaza Strip and there were about 3 of us that got out of one of the buses and listened to the gunfire happening on the Gaza Strip. You know me, I'm going to go and, you want to go out and listen? Sure, I'll go out and listen, as long as it's not actually dangerous, because I had a family to get back to. But it was interesting. And as we were riding around, I don't know what was going on the other bus, but as we were riding around, he'd tell these big, exciting stories about battles, between Israel and other people, other countries, or the establishing of Israel. He'd tell these big, exciting stories, and we figured out he was doing that every time we were passing some kind of military operation or something that we weren't really supposed to be paying attention to. So it was a distraction. Oh, I forgot to mention that we wrote somewhere, there's a book with my experiences in Israel. I think I ran across it when we were going through the storage unit. Everybody took a day writing up their perceptions of what we had done that day. And mine was, we were in Jordan. And one of the things I was impressed with was these, they were basically, you wouldn't call them adobe, but that's basically what they were. They were clay houses that the people had made. They were very square looking, but the people planted flowers all over the place growing over the tops of these buildings and everything. And I don't remember what else I talked about Jordan and what I wrote, but I mentioned the flowers. And Fosha was boring. Let's face it. Everything she wrote was excruciatingly boring. And she always talked about, newsy letters with all kinds of details, but her details were always things that I never found interesting. Like, she'd talk about something that happened at church, and she'd be talking about all the food that everybody ate, and it was like great detailed descriptions of boring, I can't even remember what they call it, where everybody brings a dish. It's not banquet, it's something like that. Anyway, but all these 57 types of Jello, kind of thing. And it's like, I'm gonna shoot myself in the head because I couldn't stand reading her letter. So, after I had written my page for the trip, what I saw in Jordan, she said, "Isn't it interesting what different people notice?" Which is her way of saying she found what I wrote boring. The fact that I noticed the people and that they did such beautiful things to their otherwise drab-looking houses on the outside. I mean, I don't know what they looked like on the inside, but the fact that they were so in love with flowers and plants and things, to me, was fascinating. The people were what fascinated me. The many types of Jello didn't interest me in the least. So So anyway, so Israel, Israel was fascinating, and we went to all kinds of places. We went to, of course, we hit all the places that the LDS Church had pegged as being significant historical points for Mormons, where Jesus was crucified and all this stuff. And I had a real, Jordan was okay. When we got to Israel, I started having problems with things because of how the Mormons acted. My dad was an agnostic, basically an atheist. And yet he raised me to be respectful of other people's religions. And we'd go into these places, they'd be Catholic or they'd be something other than Mormon. If we went someplace the Mormon church had said was sacred, everybody in the tour was very respectful. If we went someplace that the Catholic Church said was sacred, everybody's or Muslim, everybody's talking and laughing and cutting, no respect whatsoever. None. That bothered me a lot.
I could see that.
And it's just how it's one of those, it was part of what had been going, the problem with my falling away from the church was observing the reality versus what we're told all the time, and what we're told we're supposed to be, and what we're supposed to be striving to be. And I saw no effort whatsoever to show respect to anybody else. Our bus driver for our particular bus, our tour guide was Israeli. Our bus driver was Palestinian. And whenever the tour guide wasn't sucking up all the air in the room, which he usually did, we would talk to the bus driver and ask him about his religious beliefs and his family and all kinds of things. One person asked him, do you have more than one wife? He said, no, nobody does that unless your first wife is very foolish or something, which was a fascinating answer. Most of them have one wife. They don't have multiple wives. For one thing, that's like having multiple children. It's expensive, So,
that's true.
Anyway, but we went to a glassware place that was awesome, and he bought us all little. They were like Christmas ornaments. We got to pick out a little glass circular thing that we could take home with us, a little souvenir. He said that one of the big parts of his religion, Islam, is hospitality. That's very important to them, so people, we would go to see Muslim shops and so on, and they were all very welcoming, and it was about hospitality, making people feel welcome, and being generous with what you have, whether that's a lot or little. Let's see, we went to a place that sold all kinds of interesting stuff that I don't remember if it was the same place with the glassware or not, but I bought a menorah, which I eventually, I did Fiddler on the Roof in Fort Collins, Colorado for 13 weeks. And the guy who was playing Motel Camzoil, we carpooled from, was I living in Boulder? Yes, I was living in Boulder then, or Gun Barrel. I think I was living in Boulder. Wherever I was living, we carpooled up to Fort Collins. It was like an hour and 15-minute drive, one way. It was a long hike. Anyway, he was going through a lot of stuff. His father was extremely abusive, and hard on him because he was gay. Sometime during the process of that play, he found out he was Jewish, which was interesting because his father, from whom the Jewish came, was anti-Semitic, among other things. He was just basically a big racist and bigot and misogynist and homophobe and generally unpleasant man. So anyway, he found out he was Jewish and he got very excited about it and wanted to learn all about it. Well, I gave him my menorah, which meant a hell of a lot to him. I mean, I wanted the menorah. It meant a lot to me. It represented my visit to Israel and how much I loved it. But I felt like it belonged with a young man who just found out he had Jewish heritage. And I felt like that's why I picked that up, was for him. So anyway, there's that. There were a lot of things that happened. I mean, I felt pretty proud of myself a couple of times because this biblical scholar who was our tour guide, was talking about some things and a couple of times I made comments that caused him to rush to his Bible and look things up, which was kind of awesome. He didn't give me personal praise, but when I mentioned one of my favorite scriptures as agree with thine enemy while thou art in the way with him, lest he find cause against thee, which is basically saying don't argue with people, if you don't need to. Find points of agreement. And I don't remember what that came up about, but boy, he got excited about that and ran to his Bible and looked it up. It was like, yay me! I called attention to something he hadn't paid attention to before, which made me very proud, especially since I had a huge crush on it. Anyway, we went to Masada, which was fascinating. That's always been a place of interest to me for a whole lot of reasons. We basically went all over. Staying on the kibbutz was fascinating because it was just interesting how it's organized. The people, work and they have communal centers for their children. Their children basically grow up in this communal environment. They had a cafeteria for everybody to eat in, and like for breakfast, they had fresh vegetables and so on and so forth. And of course, it's kosher, so they didn't mix meat and dairy. So, it was vegetarian because, no meat with the dairy. So they would have cheese and stuff, but they wouldn't have meat. But all of us were like, boy, I like getting up every day and eating, fresh cut cucumbers and tomatoes for breakfast, It was just a really neat place. Another thing that bothered the heck out of me when I was there, because we loved our bus driver so much, our Palestinian bus driver. And all my children have heard me tell this story a million times, and a few of my friends have. But after one of these big, exciting stories the tour guide had told, Artel, your grandfather, got up and practically in tears, very moved by this story, got up and read from scripture about, I can't remember the exact scripture, and I don't care really, but the point is he got up and read a scripture about, the Israelis vanquishing evil and evildoers and all that stuff. And I looked up at the rearview mirror and could see our Palestinian bus driver was crying because my father-in-law at the time was basically calling him and his family and everybody he loved evildoers. And I kind of gently touched Lee and pointed at the rearview mirror, and she saw it too. We had a lot of interesting discussions back at our hotel room. Oh, that was another thing. You couldn't drink the water there. You couldn't even brush your teeth with the water there because it's scary water. If you drink it, you'll get sick. So we had to have bottled water all the time. We were always walking with giant bottles of Evian water. But anyway, were you going to ask a question?
No, I was just going to clarify for anyone listening that Lee was the ex-wife of my oldest uncle, David.
Yeah, right. She was the non-member on the trip, and she was my roommate. They paired us up, which was probably a mistake they made. But I guess they figured nobody else would want to room with her, and she wouldn't want to room with them. But she and I got along like gangbusters. Anyway,
Hooray!
but yeah, I just kind of felt like that was one more instance where I felt like, I'm sure that if you were to have asked Artel at the time, he would have said, I felt inspired to get up and read this passage, blah, blah, blah. And my immediate reaction was, a loving God doesn't inspire people to cause such pain. That was my reaction to that. That I felt such sympathy for the bus driver who had been so kind to us and so welcoming and such a good, obviously good person. And my father-in-law basically called him and everybody he associates with evildoers. So that was another problem that I ran into there. Let's see what else happened. Oh, at the King David Hotel, there was, of course, all of the waiters and everybody in the hotel were Palestinian Muslim. And the main guy that waited on our table when we'd go to dinner every night, I think we were there 3 days, and he had red hair, which is apparently common there. That you can talk about the reasons for that. It doesn't matter. It's red hair is common. So, or it happens anyway. So he just zeroed in on me and decided to flirt with me, and I'm easily embarrassed. So, so I remember, he was serving me because you'd have the plates and they'd put this stuff on the plates. They put your food, they ladle your food onto the plates. They didn't come out with plates of food. They ladled the food on. And at one point, he asked if I wanted something. I don't remember what it was. And he started to ladle it, and he just kept going. And he was looking intently the whole time, and the whole table just howled with laughter because I was purple with embarrassment. It was sweet though. It was nice. I was 33, so it was nice to have somebody find me attractive. So anyway, there was that. Seems like there was something else along those lines. I can't remember. If I remember it, I'll go back to it. Huh?
You went to Egypt, as I recall?
Yes, we went to Cairo after that. And of course, Lisa, that's what she most wanted to go to on the trip. I most wanted to go to Israel. She wanted to go to Egypt. Egypt was awesome. It was dusty. I mean, once we left Israel, it was amazing how hot and how barren it was. I mean, there was we went out of Israel where they've worked to, as Mormons say, make the desert bloom like a rose. It just was this vast expanse of glaring white sand. It was kind of amazing. And then another thing that happened that was upsetting, and I had always thought, I don't understand why everybody's, has such a problem with Artel. He seems like a pretty easygoing guy to me. I had problems with Fosha. Fosha and I did not get along. So the AC in the back of the bus wasn't working very well, and we were taking turns in various seats around the bus. And at that point in time, there were a number of elderly, most of the tour were very elderly people. We had one woman who was dying of cancer and just really wanted to go before she died. So she was kind of amazing because, she was there with her cane, right in the front of the group, at everything that was going on, hungry to see everything. Of course, she was also one of the ones that was the loudest whenever we went any place that wasn't LDS sanctioned. So sort of a mixed thing there. But anyway, we're all human. We're all human. Anyway, so we're in the bus, and there are a lot of elderly people sitting in the back, and they're miserable. And Artel and Fosha always sat in the front because they were tour guides. So they always sat in the front of the bus. And he's up there with right next to the, the best part of the air conditioning behind the bus driver. Different bus driver by this point, obviously, because we're going into Egypt. And he kept saying, "Oh, you people, if you'd been in the desert with the Israelis, you would have been complaining and blah, blah, blah." And he was just not terribly sympathetic. And finally, he decided to sit in the back and see what it was like. And he was miserable. And then he finally got it because, the man was incapable of empathy unless you hit him over the head with it. And boy, I became, between that and the incident, of hurting our bus driver in Israel, and that incident, where he just kept saying stupid, mean things to the people, the elderly people, older than him, sitting in the back of this bus, suffering, it's like, okay, I get it now. He is a narcissist. That's what he is. And, but he finally got it, and they made some changes to how the seating was done. I know I sat in the back to relieve the elderly, people who were suffering. And it was very, very unpleasant. It was loud. It was smelly. There was hot air from a unit back there. I guess it's the fan connected with the AC, and it was blowing hot air. It was horrible. So, and it gave off heat and everything. So anyway, we got to Cairo, and Cairo was amazing. We had a female tour guide there, and she had another guy on the tour with her, a younger man, I guess, that she was training or something, or mentoring in some way. And she was really cool. She was really cool because she was an Egyptologist. That's what she does for a living. And so she was really interesting the whole tour. And we went to a lot of really amazing places there, including going inside I think we went inside the smallest pyramid because the other ones were being repaired, I think. I can't remember the names of anything anymore. It's been too long. But it was interesting. And when I and I watch shows all the time about Egyptian archaeology and new finds of mummies and things like that, new structures, new pyramids and things like that. It's interesting because I see that repeated. And actually, we watched a show like a few weeks ago where they went into one of the 3 pyramids there in Cairo, the famous ones. And we also saw a night show, like a thing with a recorded voiceover with lights and stuff, where they talked about the pyramids and the Sphinx and all that stuff, which was really, really nifty. But anyway, you go up in the pyramid, and it's this narrow stairway that goes up and up and up and up, and it's again, it's not pleasant in there because it's kind of stuffy, and if you're at all claustrophobic, it'd be horrible. I'm not, so that wasn't a problem, but it was stuffy in there, and the air doesn't move a lot, and you get up to the top to the main rooms, and they told us how, we looked at some of the hieroglyphs painted on the wall and other things like that, and apparently they're not as bright as they used to be because Westerners, being idiots, would go in and throw gasoline on the murals to make the colors brighter so they could take their pictures. Of course, what that does is make them dimmer for everybody who comes after you. But hey, this is what human beings do. I want what I want now, and to hell with everybody else. So anyway, there's another time we were driving through Cairo. It was really crammed. It was really busy. And there was a guy out there with he was mixing some kind of slushy-like thing. he was stirring it with his arms. And we were kind of horrified. And we asked our guide, "Would you drink that?" She said, "No, that's instant death." So she was like, "No, wouldn't drink that. Don't drink that." But, one of the things that I was going to mention about being at the King David Hotel, I kind of ended up with a crippled sense of smell from the time I was 9, when I had red measles and then rubella, one right after, with really close together. I caught one on top of the other. And it knocked out my sense of smell for the most part, which is interesting because my father lost his sense of smell with his brain injury in World War II. And I'm wondering if there's sort of a loose connection somewhere in our genetic makeup that makes us susceptible to losing our sense of smell easily or something. But, people would always ask me, "Well, can you taste food?" And I can taste food. What do you mean? Until we were in Jordan and Egypt and Cairo, and we would be served these meat patties that had all kinds of spices and things in them. I assumed they were all lamb. They weren't. Sometimes they were beef, sometimes they were goat, sometimes they were sheep. They were never pork, of course. But I couldn't tell the difference between any of them. I thought they were all the same thing. I thought, okay. So apparently I'm remembering what food tastes like or something instead of actually tasting the food, because I'm sure all of those things taste very different. So that was also interesting to me anyway. May not be interesting to anybody else. But
I find it interesting.
So what else? We went to a lot of really fascinating archaeological sites. I can't remember a lot of it because it's 37, 38 years ago that I did this. And anyway, so we did all that. The last day, some of the people on the trip had paid to go to Luxor, including Lee. I decided I didn't pay for that which was stupid of me. I've regretted it ever since. And someday I'm going back and I'm going to Luxor. But anyway, I thought I better rest up because I was going to be going back home to take care of my family. And I thought, I better not. I'm going to be recovering from the flight, which was interesting in and of itself, and I didn't even mention that. We went from New York to, did we go to Germany? It seems like we had a layover in Germany or something. We were there for a while before it was a long ass trip. So, I thought I'd better rest up because I'd be recovering from the flight on the way back. And most everybody else went on to Luxor while I stayed back at the motel, or the hotel. It wasn't a motel, it was a hotel. Anyway, I got home, and it was hard for me to leave. It was really hard for me to leave. I missed my kids. In all honesty, I did not miss Richard in the least. But I missed my children. And we got back home, and that's when the other exciting things started to happen, because my testimony was pretty much gone by then. And I had already, about that time, I signed up for a acting 101 at Loretta Heights College.
Oh, so you'd planned to, so you did that before you left?
I don't remember. I think I did, because I was so miserable and I had to do something for myself for a change. And that was what I did, was take this one class. And the instructor of the class basically told me, "You need to be here full time. You should be doing this." And he told me that the whole time he was there, Tom McNally. He went on to teach elsewhere. I think he well, that's a whole other thing. We'll talk about that another time. But yeah, he basically, before he, there was an exchange program with Pennsylvania State. I think he had gone there to teach for a while, and he and Archie Smith, who was a well-known character actor and kind of amazing, was a teacher at Penn State, and he and Tom McNally switched places. Tom went to Pennsylvania State to teach, and Archie Smith came to Lynchburg College. And Tom read me, when Archie left, Tom read me Archie's rundown and talked about me having great emotional potential and other things like that. And Tom said, my job is to tell everybody, if you can do anything else, do it. He said, I'm not telling you that. You need to be doing this. You need to be acting. And, you know, it's funny, as many people who told me that, and there were a lot of them, I chose to listen to the people who said, why are you doing this? You have no talent. Rah, 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 rah. You know, for some reason, I never listen to the people, the experts who tell me I'm good at what I do. I always listen to the people who tell me, shut up and die, you know.
Yeah. Well, as you told me before that's the instinct that was programmed into you by your father.
Yeah. For some reason, he needed me to. I think he thought I was going to be arrogant or something, or he was afraid I'd find out. He thought he was a fraud, and he was afraid I'd find out he was a fraud, and so he needed to keep me focused on how incompetent I was so that I'd have more respect. I don't know. I have no idea what was going. Apparently, he told my mother all the time how brilliant I was and how talented, and I could do anything, and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, with me, I never got a single word of praise from him. So I don't know why. But anyway, so yeah, I went home and then started my, let's see, that was April. And I think in June, I started my summer class with Acting 101 at Loretta Heights. And that's when Donald and Artel came to visit. And that's when we had the exciting moment in the kitchen. Have I already talked about that on this podcast? I think I have.
I don't. I think it's worth repeating.
Okay. Anyway, we had this moment in the kitchen. This is our house in Denver. And I was having an honest crisis of faith. And the questions just started pouring out. And the response I got was from Donald, I got, you're too worldly. And from Artel, I got, you must be breaking the word of wisdom, which is the Mormon code of health, which is far more complex than not consuming alcohol, tea, or tobacco. But Mormons usually boil it down to that. There's all kinds of other stuff in there that's kind of interesting and really kind of wise, like consuming lots of fruits and whole grains and not eating too much meat, you know, and not avoiding meat just in the summer, but, you know, don't rely on meat for being the only thing you consume, and so on and so forth. It's a whole thinking about a lot of things, which was actually kind of smart. And which I paid attention to because that's the kind of person I was. You know, I tried to do the whole word of wisdom, not just the alcohol, coffee, tea, and tobacco thing. Anyway, so Artel said, you know, you must be breaking the word of wisdom. And Richard said, are you committing adultery? Which he might as well have taken a boning knife to my heart. That was probably the cruelest thing he could have said to me.
I can believe that.
For whatever reason, he never believed that I loved him. And I did for a long time, you know, until he basically mentally and emotionally abused it out of me. And I just became so numb that I felt all I felt was, I'm either going to kill myself or I have to get out of this marriage. Yeah, he just, we'll talk about that another time. But anyway, the point is that happened in the kitchen, and my response to that was, there's no place in this church for a woman who thinks. Women who think are not allowed, or women who think will be condemned, criticized, mentally and emotionally abused, condescended to. Nobody will answer your questions. They will just treat you like crap. So, anyway, I ended up enrolling in college full time, and of course a theater degree, an acting degree, and and the net result of that was when I went back to church, it was amazing what happened at church, because I would go into Relief Society and be sitting there with a ring of empty chairs around me. Nobody would talk. None of the women would talk to me. None of them would have anything to do with me because they were afraid they'd catch this desire for something outside of the home. I became a pariah. And we can talk about all that stuff another time. I don't really want to talk about it right this second.
That's fine.
But, we can talk about it next time. We'll just plow ahead. But it was painful. And I remember sitting there quietly weeping in Relief Society because I was so alone and so ostracized because I went back to college.
Right.
The glory of God is intelligence. That's a Mormon scripture. I think there's a sign outside of BYU that says that. The glory of God is intelligence. They talked about that all the time at church. And yet, if you go back to college as a woman, you're ostracized and treated like a pariah, because the glory of God may be is intelligence for men, but not for women. Women are just supposed to do what they're told and, take care of their husbands and children and do nothing for themselves and not think what they're told. And that was pretty rough, and it did not help the marriage, and it did not help my testimony. But we'll talk about all that another time. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Uncle Donald, I should talk about that. And he actually apologized a few years ago, but then, then he and Marie decided to pile on me for something else, a confrontation with Christy, my eldest daughter. And then, of course, they, without hearing my side of anything, they all, she's Mormon, therefore she's telling the truth. I'm going to try not to be bitter about this, but Uncle Donald stayed with us. After Artel left, Uncle Donald stayed with us. It may be that Artel drove him there or something. I don't remember. I don't care. But Artel left and Donald stayed with us. And I took him to class with me. I took him to school with me for a day. And I thought it was a really good day. My theater history class, Len Kujuk was the teacher, and he was friggin' brilliant, and I just adored him. He was incredibly gay, which didn't bother me in the least. I did not care. All I knew was he was a brilliant, brilliant teacher, and I just adored him. And I'm driving home. I'm driving Donald and myself home, and he turns to me, and the first words out of his mouth are, "That man is gay." And about like that. And I said, "You sat through that whole class and all you got out of it was that he was gay?" And he got real quiet because he knew that he'd said the wrong thing. Then another time during that visit, I think we were in the kitchen, I don't remember where we were, but I think we were in the kitchen. And he told me, I think he was trying to tell me that I needed to discipline I don't know what he was trying to tell me, but the way it came out was, sometimes I think about wanting to kill your kids. And I felt an ice cold shock through my whole body because Donald was mentally ill, had been for years, had been in and out of treatment for that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he did not take his medication, correct?
No, he refused to take his medication. And he had a God complex. I always thought he was insecure or something, and I said something about that to him, and he just laughed and said, no, it's the opposite. He said he thought that, if he crossed the street, he was afraid he'd cause an accident or whatever. And he was holier than thou to the entire rest of the family. He decided he was more righteous than everybody else in the family. So, when somebody like that tells you they're thinking about killing your children, you listen to them and take them seriously. And, so that night I told Richard, I said, this man cannot stay in our home any longer. He has to leave. And yeah, you listen to Richard's account of that, and it's a lot different than my account of that. I was some kind of a monster for requesting that a guy who had told me he wanted to kill my children, for telling my husband that I want that guy out of my house. And we drove him to a bus stop. It was out in the middle of nowhere, so he could catch a bus. And we all felt bad. We felt guilty leaving him standing alone at that bus stop. And he looked miserable. And I felt badly about it. But I'm sorry. I don't care how bad I feel. You're not going to be around my kids if you tell me you have an urge to kill them. So, whatever reason there was for that, that was the bottom line on that.
Well, I remember listening to you argue. I don't remember any of the details of the argument, but I do remember that the tone of your arguments took a different heat after that. It wasn't that you... As a child, I vaguely remember that I refer to that incident as the inciting incident. Like, you weren't happy before, but that was kind of a turning of the page. Did I perceive that wrong?
It was one of several. The incident in the kitchen was one with your grandfather and Donald. The experience with Donald and your father being so angry with me for not wanting somebody who says he wants to kill my kids hanging around my kids. There were several things. He was enraged at me going back to school, and gave me constant grief about it. And that's when he started, I'd be at school and I'd come home and find him with Jenny and Christy on his lap, whispering in their ears. For some reason, he never included Julie in that. I don't know why. He pretty much ignored Julie altogether. He abused the boys and ignored the girls. I need to not get carried away here. Because talking about this is pulling scabs off old wounds or pulling scars off or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I'd come home and find him with Christy and Jenny on his lap, whispering in their ears. And, I was starting to get anger from Christy about how I should be home taking care of my family and stuff. And my father even was like, you need to stop that acting stuff and take care of your family, Yeah, it was really hard to keep going during that few years because it just felt like everybody was beating me up for thinking for myself or wanting to do anything for myself. Your father had already given me grief or the money I spent on food instead of buying chips and instead of buying chips and junk food, I was buying fruit and, healthy stuff and making healthy stuff to eat at home, healthy snacks at home. I was a terrible person because I didn't just indulge him all the time. He didn't seem to have any problem with me sewing and knitting and embroidering and doing all that kind of thing. He gave me a hard time for reading. We already talked about that. I read too much. And yet at church, I don't know if I mentioned this, we were talking to somebody at church, and he said, yeah, Jody buys a lot of books. She doesn't read them, but she buys them. I was so angry with him. I was so angry with him. It was like, how dare you? How dare you say something like that to other people in front of me? He had nothing but contempt for me. And yet, when we divorced, he was like, everything I do is for you. It's like, well, you're not showing that very well. All I see is nothing but contempt for me. You act like you hate my guts. Because you hate everything about me except you think I'm pretty. That seems to be the only thing you value about me, is you think I'm pretty. You're proud of your pretty wife. And that's about it. So, and I never thought of myself as pretty, because that was also something I got hammered into my head when I was home, that I was ugly, so that was to be valued for that when that's not something I valued in myself. And nothing else, not all the work I was doing around the house, the fact that I was making all of my daughter's clothes and some of my son's clothes. I made Richard a suit. I sewed him a suit, which he was very proud of, by the way. I worked my ass off as a homemaker, but I never heard about that. All I heard about was, especially towards the end, it was everything that I was doing wrong. Anyway, I didn't mean this to be so negative, but
this is literally, in my opinion, one of the worst times of your life. It's hard to not be negative. And from
really hard not to pound away at that. But yeah, it was. I was suicidal. I was suicidal all the time. And when I wasn't suicidal, I was looking at the new townhomes and things that were being built around us and thinking, I'd love to live there, and fantasizing about your father dying various ways, which apparently is really common for women in marriages like that, relationships like that, I felt horrible for it, but it's common. Again, you're looking for an escape, and if he would have just died, it would have made things so much easier, Then I could have been there with my kids, because I loved being with my children. I loved my family. He made me miserable. My relationship with him, being tied to him, made me absolutely miserable. And if I could just get rid of him and still have the kids, everything would be beautiful. That's how I saw it. Of course, that's not true. I know damn well that there would have been problems down the line, because children grow up and they rebel and they get into trouble and all kinds of things. And that's life, that's just humanity. As we've both learned, there's no such thing as a perfect family. They're almost non-existent. Some people have very good families that are almost perfect, but there's no such thing as a perfect family. And anybody who tells you they're perfect is lying. I grew up listening to my mother talk about her perfect family. And then as we got older, and especially when she was living with us and we started talking about things, it was very clear that her family was very damaged. Very damaged. She had an alcoholic older sister and sisters who abused her and took advantage of her, and her mother was wrapped up in her home chores and in her love for her husband, my mother's father. they were seriously dysfunctional, and my grandparents were not perfect, and my mother's family was not perfect, and that's okay, because it's human beings, you know. Richard and I went to counseling eventually for our marriage. By then it was really too late. If we had gone 6-7 years earlier, we might have been able to make it work some way. Even with my problems with the church, I might have stayed in just to be there with my kids, but that wasn't going to happen. It was too late. We had waited too long. Richard's attitude was, as long as I was there, there was nothing wrong. I hadn't left him, so nothing's wrong. Everything's fine. It was far from fine, but your father, like his father, was kind of lacking in empathy and an inability to put himself in anybody else's shoes and see the reality of what's happening. So for whatever reason, that's what it was. I honestly loved your father. By the time I left, I still cared about him, but my perception was that he hated my guts, and that he was probably thinking the same thing about me that I was thinking about him. If I would just die, it would solve so many problems. I don't know if that's the case or not, but probably not, because I think he saw me as a cardboard cutout of a pretty woman. So I don't think he knew me at all. His complaint was that I had changed. Well, when he married me, I was 20. If you don't change from the time you're 20 until you're in your mid-30s, something's seriously wrong with you. And he changed a lot too, because we started out best friends, and by the time the marriage ended, he was an autocrat who, treated me like a disobedient servant, who needed to be disciplined. So, yeah. And part of the reason I changed is, I was talking about how when I joined the church, how I adopted the Mormon women's voice that I heard around me when I joined the church. They all talk in this little girl voice like this. It's very nasal, and it's very quiet and childlike and non-threatening. And I adopted that voice. I adopted a character. I was playing a character. I was in depth playing a character of a good Mormon wife. And I intended to be a good Mormon, and I put all of the energy I could into being a good mom, a good wife, a good homemaker, and a good Mormon. All of those things were important to me, and I worked so hard at it. And I was really good at some of it, but it was not appreciated in the least until I left. But after a while, playing that character was killing me. Because I was so limited in who and what I could be. And in order to play that character, I had to bury a huge part of who I was, put it away, and never think about that. And that began to eat at my soul.
Dare I say, turn it off like a light switch?
Huh? Yeah. Something like that, yes. Anyway, yeah, I had to be a more complete person than I was being allowed to be. And once I tried to become a complete person, I was told that is not acceptable. You must be shallow. I think I mentioned the Fascinating Womanhood books. That's basically what Fascinating Womanhood is about. You're supposed to be a shallow person for the men in your life. You're not allowed to be a complete human being. You have to be a flat cartoon character of a sweet woman for the sake of the men in your life. Don't ever say anything that threatens their ego. Don't say anything that, blah, blah, blah. So,
or in other words, the 1950s.
I think it was worse than the 1950s. It was more like the 1850s. Mormons in the 1850s, Mormon women were pioneers, and they were pretty tough and sturdy, and the church tends to talk about that when it's to their advantage and not talk about it when they're trying to encourage women to be obedient, because that's what it became all about after, in the late 70s, with the women's movement and everything, feminism, the rise of feminism. They were terrified that women were going to be individuals, and so the emphasis was on obedience. Be obedient. Be compliant. Don't be your wife's best friend. Be her master. Be the head of the house. That was emphasized. So, your father was a victim as much as I was of that crap. And eventually they found that, it was interesting to me that later I found out that there was a very high percentage of Mormon women who were seriously depressed and suicidal. They were really shocked when they found that out. Well, what in the hell did you expect? And apparently, according to some of your siblings, some of that teaching changed because of that, because, they realized that they were going to have a lot of women killing themselves because they were so depressed, because of the oppressive nature of, what they were stressing for families and the role of women in the house, and so on, women and girls. It's the same thing that we see with LGBTQ people in the church. It's really hard for them to stay in the church and not be depressed and suicidal because the church is so oppressive towards them. I don't know if that's changed at all in the last few years, but
it has and it hasn't.
It has not made me feel warmer towards the church or made me want to go back. So, knowing all that stuff, there's a film out about Prop 8 and the church in Prop 8 in California, where I think it was Proposition 8, where it was a gay rights thing. I don't completely remember everything about it now because I've forgotten a lot of that. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the church anymore. So whatever it was, they put in, they were taking people's college funds for their kids, bringing people in because they didn't want the church to spend money on it for obvious reasons, like maybe losing their tax-exempt status and so on. And money is, believe me, the number one important thing to the leadership of the church.
It was the first crack in the dam in same-sex marriage.
Yeah, that's okay. So anyway, they were putting a lot of effort into defeating Prop 8 in California. And they were bringing members in and demanding money. And a lot of people who couldn't afford it gave everything they had to the church to defeat Prop 8 in California. The one about the family that gave up their college fund for their kids, that is the one that got me the most. Really? You're taking their children's college money in order to defeat this proposition in California. You're sticking your nose into this law in California because you hate gay people so much that you're going to drain your members to defeat this proposition in California. It just was obscene. That movie made me so angry, and I think Greg and I got into a big fight about it. He had the Mormon Declaration printed up and put over their fireplace in their home about families, and families consist of this and that and blah, blah, blah. It was an anti-LGBTQ LGBTQ thing. And it hurt me because I had so many friends. And so many who died as a result of HIV/AIDS because of the stupidity and ignorance, the kind that's promoted by several religions, but that one was personal for me because I had been a Mormon. And, this is not loving the sinner and hating the sin. This is just plain hate. It's hatred and oppression and an insistence on everybody having their pigeonhole and staying in that damn pigeonhole, and you are never, ever to get out of that pigeonhole. Men have their role, women have their role, and nothing else is ever allowed.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!